Hi everybody, this is Tony Haynes-Shipkowski for Dr. Dreon's ACTE 630.50a class, Module 6, Accessibility for Students, especially with students with disabilities. And I just want to relate two of the things that I use in my class. One will be a notebook file very similar to a PowerPoint. I use those every day in all my lessons to convey information and the concepts that we'll be learning. And then I'm going to briefly go through a review that I use and relate it to the readings of the UDL standards, especially the UDL standards, referencing also the Rice reading and occasionally the guidelines that we got from the pcc.edu. So let's just get started right away. This is an example of one of the first slides I always do. It's a check for prior knowledge, which is UDL standard 3.1 talks about checking for prior knowledge like bell ringers. Rice also references that on page 221, a quick check for understanding through oral or written expression. And that is also talking, one of the interventions she talks about in Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions for students that have learning disabilities. Again, I like to do these because they're quick and easy. And it also gives me a quick and easy way of students that may not be comfortable writing things down, they can answer it orally, or those that don't like to raise their hand and answer questions, they can show that they understand stuff through a quick written expression. Usually I do this on the front of our note packet. Every chapter has a packet of notes. We don't use books at Lebanon. We have notes that we print out for the students that explicitly follow these notebook files, which are like PowerPoints. And I like that one because it limits the amount of books in and out of my room, and two, it's easy and more manageable for the students, as well as it's less burdensome, if you will, because they don't have to look at the whole book and like, oh my gosh, we have to learn that later. The note packets are very specific and very confined to what they show the students. To keep going with everything that I want to talk about here, UDL Standard 6.2 talks about prompts to show and explain work. We do this through what's called a Collins writing. It's a program that Lebanon uses that has them use writing to express their understanding in all four content areas: English language arts, social studies, science, and mathematics. And this is kind of an example of one of their very basic setups for writing, where students answer a very brief prompt. It's considered a type 1. It's just something that they can do very quickly in 30 seconds to a minute. And we do these also at the end. And that's what Rice again talks about on page 221, frequent checks for student understanding. And this is a written expression. They can also, like I said, answer it orally. She also discusses that on page 219 in the Rice book about assessing students' work orally. Again, if I'm running out of time, I can have students answer these questions quickly, and or if I don't want to spend too much time on it at the beginning, they can answer it orally and then maybe go back and record their answers at a later time. To keep going, the next thing that I always go through here in these slideshows is I always display the lesson EQ. I don't do unit EQs because I show them the unit EQs almost every time because the lesson EQs become the unit EQs. And the UDL standard 6.1 talks about posting the goals or objectives. Well, to me, the EQ is the goal or the objective. How do I find the solution to special types of linear systems? How do I separate numbers into rational, irrational numbers? Or what makes something irrational or rational? This is my goal or my objective that I want to display to my students so they know what's expected of them throughout the lesson. And I think a lot of the videos that we watched a couple weeks ago, where we assessed some lessons, almost every single teacher, if not all of them, had an EQ or a goal or objective for their students. Next thing I always go through is the vocabulary. This goes along with UDL Standard 2.1, where I pre-teach vocab and symbols. These are the vocabulary words that the students might not have seen before, or they're words that haven't really been used. This is where they come from right here. And this is where I review them. The next thing, I'm going to probably stay on this slide for a while just to talk about a few things that I do throughout my lesson. One thing that the UDL standards talk about is consistent and meaningful exposure in UDL standard 2.3. every lesson's the same way. It's set up the same way where we have a bell ringer. I review the EQ, I review the vocab, and then we go right into the lesson. And every lesson builds off. How I do it is every lesson starts off with a simple concept. And what we do is we set up a step-by-step process using a graphic organizer, which goes along with UDL Standard 3.2. And what Rice also talks about on page 225, where she talks about using guides to provide support and promote autonomy. Sorry, I always screw that word up. Me personally, I like having visuals, which you can see here with the graph. But I also like having step-by-step processes that I can follow. I found, and I think we can all agree, math has a lot of patterns. Problems are always solved in similar fashions when we're talking about things like right here, systems of linear equations. So my students and I will come up with, using a graphic organizer, like UDL Standard 3.2 talks about, how do we solve a problem? And usually I have a bulleted list of steps for my students to follow, which a lot of the UDL standards talk about. Same thing with Rice and the accessibility guidelines that we have from pcc.edu. One of the big things they talk about in PowerPoints, which, like I said, notebooks are very similar to PowerPoints, is the use of lists to solve problems. Bulleted list or step-by-step list to solve problems. And I use those almost every lesson, which I really like to do because it helps me and it helps my students. Another thing that the UDL standards 5.1 and 5.3 talk about are solve problems with a variety of strategies or different approaches and strategies. Again, I like to do the step-by-step list. I think it helps my students. A lot of them don't have the confidence in math. So if I can have them follow these step-by-step problems, it really helps me feel confident in my students, and it helps them feel confident in themselves, which really works well for me. But on a note from that, I never liked teachers that told me I had to do something a particular way. I mean, I didn't disrespect them, but I didn't like the fact that they told me I had to do something a particular way. If I found an easier way but still got the right answer, why couldn't I do my work and show my work that way? Why did I always have to do it their way? And I don't mean any disrespect to anybody in our class that does that. I do stress to my students that they should follow our guidelines that we created, our graphic organizers that we created, because majority of the problems that we do follow those steps. But again, I also like to express that, hey, if you can find an easier way to do something, do it that way. Which kind of goes along with UDL standards 8.2 and 8.4, where it says differentiate difficulty, make the problems a little harder for some and a little easier for others, but also help the students show that they're right or where they made a mistake. And I think with this step-by-step process that I like to use in every lesson, where the students create a step-by-step group of steps to follow, it helps them find, oh, hey, I did this, but here I think I might have messed up, and helps them go back and find where they've screwed up, or where maybe I made the mistake in my explanation, maybe on purpose or maybe not. It's really cool to watch my students use the list that we've created as a class, which was a couple of the teachers that we assessed a couple weeks ago. A couple of them use that strategy, and it really helps mastery, which the standards also talk about. Just to touch base on a couple other things that I found in my PowerPoints that I use, or my notebooks that I use. The UDL standard of number 1 with perception, it talks about the availability for students that may have physical handicaps that they can't record notes. Every lesson has been recorded by one of our former teachers, and it follows the notes almost explicitly, where the problems that we have in the notes, like right here or here, are reviewed in the chapter, or on the YouTube video, which they can access online. On page 221, Rice talks about the availability for students, the teachers, to make presentations and notes available for the students to view and print later. I don't really do that, but I have the ability to do so. For my students, I don't really have any physically handicapped students that can't write. I don't really have any visually handicapped students that can't see, but all the videos, like I said, are available on my Schoology page that the students can access at a later point and use to help go through their notes, or if they missed something or anything like that. A couple other things that I want to touch base on here quickly with my notebook files. I do like to use visuals, as you can see here, but I also think the graphic organizers that I use in various lessons and the step-by-step processes count as visuals, which is UDL standard 2.5. It talks about using those. The web guidelines really talk about explicit prompts for step-by-step, and page 223 in the Rice reading talks about chunking info. I like to do that. Again, I can't stress that enough. I like to do the step-by-step processes. But it also talks about that the web guidelines and the reading, all the readings that we've talked about today, or in this lesson, talk about sequential highlighting or progressive release of info. My lessons build off of each other, but not only do the lessons build off of each other, but one section, the first section in the notes, goes through the basics, and then the next section adds another step, and then maybe another step in the third section. I don't just automatically throw my students to the wolves, so to speak, where they have to solve the most difficult problems right away. We build off of each lesson, we build off of each part of each lesson from one part to the next, which is one of the things that the web guidelines and the UDL standards talk about. One more thing that I want to touch base on is that UDL standard 7.3 talks about routine, and Rice also talks about that on page 222, that students with different types of learning disabilities really do well with routine, and I'm very much a creature of habit, so to speak. One thing that Rice talks about on page 222 is that in history class you use note-taking strategies to outline the chapter before students begin to read it. That's in table 8.4. But also, like I said, UDL standard 7.3 talks about class routines, and my classes all follow the same setup. They follow these types of notebook files where they have to go through things and go through the notes with me, creating step-by-step processes, reviewing the vocab, EQs, so on and so forth. I'm very much into that in terms of using routine to help my students. There's so much more I could talk about here with my notebook files, but a couple things I want to touch base on is that like here's an example of a graphic organizer that we use. We break it down into intersecting lines, parallel lines, and then at the bottom is overlapping lines. This is a graphic organizer that I constantly have my students reference if they need help. The next part is not using a visual. How do I look at problems that follow the same setup of the problems that we just did visually, but they don't have the graph? What do I look for? How do I assess them? What needs to be there? And finally, to wrap it up, here's an example of a Collins writing type 2. It kind of follows that chart that I just talked about, which again, this is a differentiating an approach or strategy to these types of problems. You know, some students like that checklist, that visual review. Some people just need the words. Some people just need the criteria, if you will, to look for. And this is one of those ways that we do that. This is an example of UDL 6.2, a prompt to show and explain work. You know, first off, this shows your mastery. If they can explain, how do I know there's one solution, no solution, or infinitely many solutions to a system of linear equations? I'm differentiating instruction. Like I said, there's a lot of things that I talked about here, I touched on briefly, but I found out through this that I think I do a better job of differentiating my instruction for different learning disabilities, not necessarily on purpose, but just in the way that I teach. And I think it's effective based off of the results of my lessons. So I look forward to your feedback, and hope to talk to you guys soon. I'll also have a second video looking at my review, my Word document review that I used for the same chapter. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.